going to look at the relationship between immigration policy and inflation in this video. Now, the relationship between immigration policy and inflation may not be as clear as you may first think. Now, immigration policy increases both the supply of labor as well as the population. So immigration policy, I'm just going to note up here, increases 1. Supply of labor, and 2. The population. So as we talked about, immigration policy relates to humanitarian, family, as well as skilled migration into the country. Now, as we talked about in our very early lectures, supply of labor, or the supply of labor available for firms, is a supply factor. However, the population size is a demand factor. So, how large a population is affects the aggregate demand of an economy. So, with that in mind, we're going to look at how immigration policy can affect inflation. Inflation, as we all know, as we've all talked about, is the major economic goal. And inflation is achieved, or the goal of low inflation is achieved, when CPI is around 2 to 3% per annum on average over the course, or over the medium term. So over the course of the business cycle, 7 to 10 years, or the medium term. So that is the major goal of the RBA. So we're going to split this video up into 2 parts. Firstly, we're going to look at how immigration policy can affect cost inflation. And secondly, we're going to look at how immigration policy affects demand inflation through this population channel. Demand inflation. And we're looking at cost inflation first because we consider immigration policy to be an aggregate supply management policy. Okay, let's look at cost inflation. Cost inflation occurs because businesses want to make a margin on their product. And so when their cost of production increase, they're going to push up prices because they want to keep that margin. Fairly simple idea. Businesses act to maximize or exist to maximize profits. So when there is a larger supply of labor, this means they have greater choice as to who to employ. Take an example of, say, 2 people in a workforce. Say you're an employer and you want either one of these 2 people to work. They have the same skills and they have the same qualifications. One person offers you $10 per hour, the second person offers you $5 an hour. Of course you're going to go to that person who offers you $5 an hour, because then, say in labor is your only cost, or only production cost, then you can say you can sell the good at $10. Whereas if you want to make the same $5 profit by hiring the person who charges $10 an hour, you would have to charge $15 for your good. So let's visualize this. Person 1, person 2. Same person, same age, same super contribution, whatever. Person A, person 1, $10 an hour, person 2, $5 an hour. Product, or you want profit, equal to $5. That's the goal. Charging person 1 to make the same profit, you want to charge $15. Person 2, to make the same profit, you want to charge $10 for that product. So as you can see, by having a greater supply of labor, by choosing migrants overseas who have the same skill set, the same qualifications, of course, as a disclaimer, of course no one has the same skills and qualifications, that would be absurd, but just in a very theoretical way, this gives businesses greater choice as to who to employ. Simple as that, because labor costs being the greatest expense for businesses, that would dramatically improve their ability to cut down prices or put down prices, as well as maintain the same profit margin. Okay, so secondly, skilled immigration improves efficiency, because we have what is known as a skills shortage, and that relates to the idea that we have the capital equipment, but we don't have the people who have the necessary skills to use it. And so by importing, that could be a very crude term, by encouraging people to migrate over to Australia to help us use these capital goods, then that would improve the efficiency through which we produce goods and services. And again, efficiency relates to the idea of aggregate supply and therefore cut down cost inflation, because say prior to skilled labour moving across, we could produce at 5 units per hour. Now we can produce using the same amount of capital, 10 goods an hour. Therefore, in theory, we've cut down our production costs by half. So that's the main idea relating to cost inflation, is that A, there is a greater supply of labour, and B, there is an increase in efficiency. So in theory, inflation would go down, correct? So that is the argument of how immigration policy can decrease inflation in the long term. However, in the short term, we can see that there is also this idea of demand inflation. This is very ominous. Demand inflation is caused by excessive aggregate demand. And demand inflation only occurs when aggregate demand exceeds aggregate supply. So where there is not enough supply in order to satisfy the demand of the nation. So when we start using immigration policy, then therefore more people have actually entered the country. And so when more people enter the country, that means the overall demand, or the aggregate demand of the economy, would theoretically, or obviously, increase. And let's assume that in the short run, they can't actually alter the aggregate supply too much, because they have to adapt to changing technological conditions. They have to learn how to use machines. They have to adapt to the Australian workplace environment. And so aggregate supply stays relatively constant. And so what happens is that demand inflation in this example would increase, because aggregate demand, these people still need food, they still need whatever they need to survive, and they would compete for these goods and services with domestic consumers or domestic residents. And so aggregate demand would increase, and hence demand inflation would increase. So we're going to put a big cross there, or a little cross. Little cross, big cross. And we all know, it says the same thing, that demand inflation would increase. So a very prevalent or very obvious example of that in Australia is housing prices. So a lot of people, there are more people in Australia than there are houses, and the problem with that is that most of these people can't afford to purchase their own dwelling, and as a result, because people started to invest in these housing prices, because of demand for housing prices, because of immigration investment, whatever you want, housing prices in Australia have increased by a very large amount in recent years. And so this, by pushing up housing prices, and housing being a very large expense to most people, this would actually add to demand inflationary pressures. So as a result, in the short run, we can see that immigration policy, although it actually improves the supply of labour, by increasing the supply of labour, concurrently the population size has actually increased, and as a result aggregate demand would increase, and demand inflation will occur in the short run if aggregate supply is unable to keep with it. Of course, however, in the long run, cost inflation will be eased because of this idea of improved efficiency and a greater choice as to who to employ, thereby decreasing real unit labour costs in the long run. So this is sort of like a double-edged sword. There are two arguments, one for, one against, and it gives you an idea of how to interpret immigration policy and how that affects the goal of low inflation in Australia.